I'm 65 years old. I've spent my whole life as an ordinary woman from a quiet Canadian town. A wife, a mother, the keeper of a cozy home my husband and I built with our own hands. I always believed family meant safety, a place where you're loved and protected. But after my husband passed away, I learned that sometimes the people closest to you can be the most dangerous. My own children decided they didn't need me. They needed my house. They wanted to put me in a nursing home and declare me incompetent, so they could take what my husband and I had spent a lifetime building. And you know what I realized? Sometimes your strength isn't in youth. It's in standing up and saying, "No, I will not hand my life over to someone else." If you feel like everything is being taken from you, remember, you have the right to protect what's yours, even if you have to stand against those you love. Today, I'm going to share my story about betrayal, fear, and the strength I found when I thought I had lost everything. While you're here, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, what matters more to you? Keeping your home or keeping the relationship? I want to read every single answer. I always thought the hardest thing about a funeral was the sound of dirt hitting the coffin lid. A dull thud, like a blow to the heart. But it turned out, what's worse is the silence after everyone leaves. When the benches are empty, when my neighbor Mary stops fussing over me, adjusting my scarf, when the priest says his "May the Lord grant him rest," and everyone decides they've done enough for me. That's when the silence settles on your shoulders like a wet blanket. My name is Margaret Wilson. Yesterday, I buried my husband. Today, for the first time in 41 years, I woke up alone in our house on Willow Street. The house creaked the way it always had. The old staircase, the radiators, the wind against the bedroom window. George always said he'd rebuild it all if he had the strength and the time, but I liked it as it was, with the carpet that remembers the children's steps, the tea stain on the windowsill, my violets in the kitchen. I put the kettle on, then caught myself automatically taking 2 mugs from the cupboard. I set the second one back and leaned on the table with both hands, as if I suddenly needed the support. By lunchtime, the kids had come. Gavin, in the coat he wears for important deals, which somehow makes him taller and firmer than in real life. Lauren, in a beige coat, hair in a perfect bun, flawless like a bank display window where she works. They spoke in calm, even voices, like they were soothing a client. I listened and thought, adult children have a certain tone. It promises care but carries distance. "Mom," Gavin said without taking off his scarf, "we'd like to discuss, well, the coming weeks." "Of course," I replied and brought out a plate of cookies, leftovers from the memorial, brought by one of the neighbors. "You need someone to be here with you," Lauren said, putting her phone face down. "For a while. We'd worry less. You know how complicated things are these days." For a while, the phrase made something tighten in my chest. I nodded because that's what you do. People worry, people say what's right. We sat in the living room. They were eager to get to the practicalities. I heard the familiar phrases, "We're here for you, we'll help, your well-being matters to us." All the right words, only too smooth. I wanted something rougher, for someone to hug me awkwardly, spill sugar on the rug, forget to turn off the hallway light, like George used to. But order stood guard at the door. "Mom," Gavin went on, "Lauren and I have an idea. Just hear us out calmly. We think you'd be better off in a place where you'd get professional care. For a while until you," he paused searching for the word, "adjust." I looked at my hands. On my ring finger was a thin line where my wedding ring had been before I took it off last night when I came home. I'd put it in a box with George's letters, thinking it was only temporary. "I'll adjust here at home," I said. My voice came out quiet but steady. "We understand," Lauren replied quickly. "It's just, living alone is a big responsibility. You might forget to turn off the stove, trip on the stairs." "Mom, we worry." "I've been using that stove for 20 years, I said. "And I've never burned the house down." Gavin smiled for exactly 1 second. "It's not an accusation, Mom. We just want you to be safe." I poured them tea. They took the mugs but didn't drink. Steam fogged Lauren's glasses, and she took them off, carefully wiping them with a napkin. I suddenly remembered how, at 6 years old, she was afraid of the dark hallway and always asked me to go first. Now her hallway was bright and corporate, leading to an office where decisions are made about other people's lives. "There's a good facility an hour's drive from here," Gavin said, scrolling through his phone. "By the lake. Fresh air, good care, doctors, a kitchen." We visited. "It's very nice. You've already been there?" I asked evenly. "We." Lauren glanced at her brother. "We thought ahead. You might like it." My thoughts moved slowly, like cars on our street in winter. They thought ahead. While I was picking flowers for the funeral, they were checking out a place to put me for a while. It wasn't out of malice. My children aren't monsters. It was efficiency, practicality, what my generation called business sense. But under that business sense was something else. Fear of old age, of someone else's weakness, which is easier to hand over to professionals. I didn't argue. We agreed to look at options and think about it after the weekend. They left, and the house filled again with sounds you only hear alone. The ticking clock, the radiator's murmur, the rustle in the attic where the Christmas decorations sit in an old shoebox. I sat by the window where George used to read his papers and opened his favorite one. The subscription still in my name. The articles blurred together. The letters swam. At the back was the classifieds. House for sale. Urgent. Park View. I closed the paper and went to the kitchen. The kettle had boiled again. Too soon. I'd forgotten to turn it off. I switched it off and stood listening as the steam faded into silence. You might forget, Lauren had said. You might trip, Gavin had said. Their lists of fears lay before me like papers pushed across a desk. Nothing serious, just a formality. The phone rang. Mary. Margaret, dear, how are you? I baked a pie. I'll bring it over tonight. And, if you need, my nephew can take a look at that bathroom faucet. It was dripping last week. Thank you, Mary, I said. The faucet can wait. The pie sounds lovely. We chatted about nothing, the way only good neighbors can. I hung up and walked into the living room. On the dresser were photographs. George and me at Niagara Falls, the kids in silly hats at the skating rink. Christmas at home, the fireplace glowing, the turkey far too big for our little family. I picked up the skating rink photo. In it, Gavin was still a boy, holding my hand and laughing so wide you could see all his teeth. Back then, there were no deal coats, and no confident realtor's stride. Back then he was afraid of falling. The mail came. Official envelopes, a condolence card from the church, a flyer in big letters. Free yourself from the hassle. Sell your home without repairs or fees. I smiled crookedly and tossed it in the bin. My hands were trembling. Not from age, but from a new mix of exhaustion and anger I hadn't yet learned how to carry. That evening, I opened the wardrobe in George's bedroom. On the top shelf was a box of his letters and old photos. I took one out, the two of us young, sitting on a bench by the river in Montreal. My face was serious, as if I already knew there'd be many joys and many losses, and I needed to remember it all honestly. Next to it in the box was a notebook. Mine, long forgotten. The pages were crisp and empty. I took a pen and wrote at the top, Diary. Then the date. And underneath, Memory. To write something down is to give it form. And if it has form, it's harder for someone to twist it into their version of your story. They taught us that in school. What's written down exists. I wrote how they came, what they said, how the tea grew cold on the table, untouched. I wrote about the kettle boiling. I wrote that I'd turned it off in time. When night fell, Mary came with her pie. Apple with cinnamon. We sat in the kitchen for 5 minutes. 2 women life had squeezed into small shapes, but who still stirred the batter with a spoon. She told me the street's news. Mr. Hunter's new grandchild, Mrs. Lawrence raccoon in the trash again. I laughed quietly, and it made us both feel lighter. If the kids start pushing, tell me, Mary said at the door. I don't hear so well these days, but I can still be loud. I will, I nodded, and then added, they want me to adjust in some special place. Mary frowned. Special places are fine when you choose them yourself. Not when someone picks them for you while you're picking out a wreath. Yes, I said, and closed the door. That night, the house breathed beside me like it was alive. I dreamed of George, sitting in our chair, reading the paper, nodding at me like someone who knows everything but never forces it on you. I woke before dawn, turned on the lamp, sat at the table, and opened the notebook again. If memory is my home, I wrote, then home is my memory. And I'm still here. I didn't yet know how exactly I'd protect myself. I didn't know where the line was between care and control. But I knew one thing. I would no longer let anyone speak about me as if I was already gone. I have a name. I have hands that know where the salt is kept and how cinnamon crunches on a pie. I have a voice. And as long as it's still here, I will remain in this house, where every morning starts with the kettle, not a schedule of procedures. That year my hair was shoulder length, and I could still afford to buy perfume from a little boutique on the corner of St. Catherine Street. It was late 1970s Montreal, a city that smelled of coffee, gasoline, and new beginnings. I worked as a university librarian and lived in a tiny rented apartment with thin walls, behind which my neighbor endlessly practiced the trumpet. I met George in a coffee shop I stopped at every morning before work. I liked to sit at the far table by the window, a spot where you could see the street but remain hidden in shadow yourself. That day he came in wearing a rain-soaked coat, his hair damp like a schoolboy caught in a storm. He ordered a double espresso and scanned the room for a free seat. All the tables were taken, except mine. I looked up from my book and met his eyes. "Excuse me, may I?" he asked. His voice was low, calm, but carried a warm smile in its tone. "Of course," I replied. We didn't talk much. He drank his coffee. I read Lord of the Flies. But before leaving, he said, "If it rains again tomorrow, I'll come back here. I hope you'll be here too." I didn't answer, but the next day I arrived earlier than usual. That's how it all began, with coffee and rain. We met at that cafe nearly every day until one afternoon, he suggested, "How about we skip the coffee and just take a walk?" We wandered through the park, ate ice cream, and I learned that he was an engineer, born in Quebec, and that his dream was to build a house by the water. He spoke about it as if he could already see every room. 6 months later we were married. Not out of haste, but because we both knew there was no reason to wait. Our wedding had 20 guests. Parents, a couple of friends, my colleagues from the library. I wore a dress I'd sewn myself. Simple, with long sleeves. George never let go of my hand, even when we were cutting the cake. The house I live in now we bought 2 years later. Small, with a leaning shed and peeling paint on the porch, but with a garden where apple trees were already growing. We repainted the walls ourselves. George laid the floors, and I learned how to plaster. In the evenings we'd sit on the porch with cups of tea and make plans. How many children we'd have, what we'd name them, where we'd go in the summer. When Gavin was born, I was so happy it felt like my heart might burst. He cried as if demanding the whole world acknowledge his arrival. Lauren was quieter when she came. Tiny, with dark eyes that immediately locked onto my face. George said then, "Well, that's it. Now there are 4 of us. The 4 of us against the whole world." We were an ordinary family. Sleepless nights, toys scattered across the floor, photo albums where I wrote down the dates of first steps. Gavin was full of energy, always pushing ahead. Lauren was the observer, watching for a long time before doing anything perfectly on the first try. Even back then there were moments that, now with the years between us, seem like foreshadowing. Gavin liked to win. It didn't matter if it was a school game or an argument over who would take out the trash. Lauren always wanted praise, and if someone else got it, she withdrew. I thought those were just childish traits that would smooth out with time. But perhaps a person's nature is like a river. You can build a dam, but the course remains the same. The years passed. George worked and so did I. We saved money so the kids could attend good schools. In summer we went to Ontario, renting a cottage by the lake. We'd fish, play board games, roast marshmallows over a campfire. Sometimes I'd wake earlier than everyone, step out onto the porch, and watch the mist settle over the water. Back then I thought, this is life. May it always be like this. But life doesn't stay the same. When the children grew up, we saw them change. Gavin went into real estate and quickly learned that in that business, money is made by those willing to be cold. Lauren joined a bank and mastered the art of making every client feel special. I was proud of them, and didn't notice that between us there was more politeness and less warmth. George's death sped everything up. In their eyes I began to see not only concern, but calculation. They looked at this house the way George once looked at old houses, weighing its square footage, what renovations it needed, how much it could sell for. It was a look I had never seen directed at me before. And it frightened me more than loneliness. I always believed childhood was the foundation of everything. That if you loved a child, fed them on time, and listened to them, they would grow into a kind person. I wasn't a perfect mother, but I tried. Maybe I tried too hard. Gavin grew up noisy and restless. He always wanted to be first, at school competitions, in line for ice cream, even when we were just walking down the street. He would insist on walking ahead. I was proud of his energy, but sometimes it turned into stubbornness. If something didn't go his way, he could slam a door or quit a game altogether. George used to say, "He just has a winner's temperament." I would smile then, but now I understand. A winner's temperament without the ability to lose gracefully turns into a predator's temperament. Lauren was the opposite of her brother. Always nearby, always quieter, but her silence was attentive. She could sit with a coloring book and still listen to every word George and I exchanged in the kitchen. Sometimes I'd catch her gaze and realize, she remembered everything. At school, teachers adored her. Diligent, polite, always willing to help. But if someone took her place, in line, on a team, in someone's affection, she would withdraw. She wouldn't argue or cry. She would simply disappear. I remember one incident. Gavin was about 10, Lauren 8. They were playing baseball outside with the neighborhood kids. Gavin caught the ball and won the game for his team. He was overjoyed, while Lauren had missed several times that day and sat on the bench, frowning. I went over to her and said, "Not everything in life is about winning. Sometimes it's more important just to be part of the team." She nodded, but her eyes were cold. I remember thinking, she doesn't agree. George loved spending time with the children. In the evenings he read them books, from The Little Prince to The Hobbit. We had a family dinner tradition where each person said what they were grateful for that day. Gavin was thankful for winning a match. Lauren for someone complimenting her drawing. Neither of them ever said, "for family." But perhaps in childhood, you don't need to say it out loud for it to be true. The first warning signs came when they were teenagers. Gavin began questioning how we spent money. One day, after hearing we wanted to renovate the bathroom, he said, "Why? It won't add to the house's value." I laughed. "We live here, not selling it." He shrugged, but I noticed. He was already thinking of the house as a commodity. Around the same time, Lauren started to distance herself. She studied a lot, went to extra classes, worked part-time at a cafe. But whenever we suggested spending time together, she refused. Sometimes I caught a look in her eyes that felt like she was tired of us, as if George and I were in the way of who she wanted to become. And yet, despite these small cracks, we remained a family. We celebrated Christmas together, spent summers at the lake, went on picnics. I believed love and the habit of being together could outlast any disagreements. Only now, sitting alone in the living room, do I realize that maybe back then I ignored the fact that their love for me always passed through the prism of their own interests. Gavin valued me for supporting his ventures and always praising him. Lauren, for listening to her endless stories about work and friends, even when I'd had a hard day myself. Maybe that's normal. Maybe all children, at some point, begin to see their parents differently. But there's a difference between looking with care and looking with calculation. Now I understand that differently happened earlier than I thought. George had always been strong. Even after 60, he could spend an entire day working in the garden, digging the soil, painting the fence, and still carry a heavy bag of soil up onto the porch for my flowers in the evening. He used to say, "You have to keep yourself in shape, Margaret, or you'll rust." I'd laugh and tell him he'd never rust. But the rust came quietly. First, fatigue. He started sitting down in his chair more often, even before we'd cleared the table. Then came a strange cough that wouldn't go away. The doctors took their time with the diagnosis, but when they finally gave it, I felt the world crack. Lung cancer. A stage you don't speak aloud if you want to keep pretending. I tried to stay strong. I went with him to every appointment, kept a notebook with the doctor's notes, read articles on nutrition and breathing exercises. Some nights I'd wake up just to check if he was still breathing. When he slept peacefully, I'd sit there in the dark, listening to that steady sound, memorizing it the way you memorize a favorite song. The kids visited, but less and less. Gavin was always buried in deals, Lauren swamped with work. They helped, yes, but it was help on a schedule, as if they were ticking a box, visited parents. George never said anything to them, but I saw the way he looked out the window whenever visits were mentioned. His eyes were empty. One evening, when he was feeling worse, we were sitting in the kitchen. I was brewing him herbal tea when he suddenly said, "When I'm gone, promise me you'll stay here. Don't give up this house. It's yours as much as it was mine." Of course, George. But why are you saying this? I felt a lump in my throat. He shrugged. Just promise me. A house is memory. If they take it from you, you'll have nothing left to hold on to. Back then, I didn't think much of the word take. I assumed he meant strangers, some accident, maybe a forced sale. But now I understand. He meant our own children too. His passing was quiet. He left in the night while I was dozing in a chair beside his bed. I woke up to a strange silence, stood up, and knew immediately he was gone. And in the same instant, his request echoed in my mind. Don't give up the house. The funeral passed quickly, almost mechanically. I did everything that needed to be done, but it was as if I was watching myself from the outside. After the memorial, the kids stayed behind to help sort through things. I said I wasn't ready. They exchanged a glance, and for the first time, I saw impatience in their eyes. A couple of weeks later, Lauren came over with a brochure. On the cover were smiling elderly people in bright, airy rooms. Mom, just take a look. It doesn't mean you have to agree. But it's beautiful, clean, safe. I took the brochure without opening it. I'm safe here, Lauren. For now, yes, she said. But we don't want to wait until something happens. That evening, Gavin stopped by unannounced. He brought documents that just needed signing to simplify the legal matters with the house. I opened the folder and saw it was a power of attorney. You want me to sign the house over to you? I asked. Not sign it over, Mom. Just so I can handle legal issues. In case of something urgent. Like what? Well, repairs, sale taxes. I closed the folder carefully and pushed it away. George asked me to make sure this house always stayed mine. Gavin sighed like a man whose business was being inconvenienced. Mom, we're just trying to do the right thing. That night, I couldn't sleep for hours. I lay there in the dark thinking, so this is what he meant by take. George knew. He saw them as they truly were, in a way I refused to. And I think that was the moment something inside me clicked. Fear began to turn into a cautious anger. I realized that if I gave in now, I'd be giving up everything. At first, I chalked everything up to grief and exhaustion. When you lose someone you've spent your whole life with, the days become thick and sticky, like honey, and it's easy to lose track of small things. But then the small things became too strange to be coincidences. The first thing I noticed was that a box of documents had gone missing. It had been in the bottom drawer of George's study desk. Copies of our insurance papers, tax receipts, a few old contracts. I had kept it in the same place for 20 years. One evening, planning to check the gas bill, I opened the drawer, empty. I searched the whole desk, the shelves, even the closet. The box was gone. The next day, Lauren came over to help with cleaning. I mentioned the missing documents. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. Mom, maybe you moved them somewhere yourself? You know, lately you've been, well, sometimes mixing things up. I felt a coldness spread inside me. Lauren, I've kept them in the same place for 20 years. I understand, but grief, stress, it all affects you. You shouldn't worry about one box. Everything can be replaced. She spoke softly, but behind her words was not care. It was a ready-made diagnosis. A week later, something else happened. I've always organized my medicines, and before George's too, into a small plastic pillbox for each day of the week. One morning I opened the Monday compartment and found twice as many pills as there should be. I counted. Yes, someone had added extras. I didn't tell anyone. I just threw away the excess. But the thought lodged itself in my mind. Someone wants me to make a mistake. Then came the forgotten items. I'd walk into the kitchen and couldn't find the kettle. It was in the pantry behind jars of preserves, though I had never put it there. The sugar bowl turned up in the freezer. My wool shawl, the one I wore in the garden, ended up in the trunk of my car. One day my neighbor Mary mentioned casually. Lauren asked me if I'd noticed you becoming forgetful. I told her no. But Margaret, is everything all right with you? I smiled and said I was fine, but inside I was boiling. So Lauren was already collecting opinions. Another time Gavin came over with his tablet. He showed me a listing for a house in our neighborhood. See, Mom, this one sold for $300,000. And yours is twice the size. That's serious capital. You could live off the interest and not worry about a thing. I don't think about money, I said. I have a house and it sustains me. A house doesn't sustain you, Mom. It costs money to maintain, and you, well, you're not getting any younger. The way he said, not getting any younger, it was as if he were speaking to me as a legal guardian, not as a son. That same evening, I got a letter from the medical center. It said an assessment had been scheduled for my cognitive functions. I hadn't signed up for any assessment. I called them, and they told me family members recommended it due to reports of forgetfulness and disorientation. I sat in the kitchen, holding the phone, feeling a cold creep down my spine. They weren't just hinting anymore. They were officially building a case for my incompetence. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the floor, the windows. This was my life. Every scuff on the floor, every crack in the plaster was a story, and they wanted to turn it into real estate. I realized I had to act. But first, I had to stay silent and observe. I dug out my old camera and began photographing everything. How the furniture was arranged, what was in the cupboards, where the medicines were kept. I decided that if something changed, I'd have proof. And I opened my diary again, recording every tiny detail. Not just the date, but the time, the smells, the sounds, my mood. If they wanted to paint me as forgetful, they'd have a hard time when I had everything documented to the minute. What I didn't know yet was just how far they were willing to go. I've always thought legal matters were just boring paperwork handled by people in suits with briefcases. But now I saw them differently, as weapons. And I had to learn how to use them. First, I made it a rule to keep everything. Grocery receipts, pharmacy prescriptions, letters from neighbors, even Mary's little notes offering pie. I put it all in a separate folder. Dates, signatures, stamps, anything that could prove I lived a normal, independent life. Then I bought a small voice recorder. It fit in the pocket of my robe and could be turned on with one movement. I didn't know if these recordings would ever be useful, but I felt that sooner or later I'd need to prove that my children were not caring guardians, but people with a plan for my house. A few days later, I called a legal aid office. I explained my situation, trying to speak calmly, without emotion. The woman on the other end listened attentively and suggested we meet. The main thing, she said, is to have as many facts as possible, not just words. Recordings, documents, witnesses. That will help if this goes to court or child services. I went to the meeting wearing my best dark blue coat, with my hair neatly done. Not to impress anyone, but because I knew any sign of neglect could be used as proof I was unfit. The lawyer, Mrs. Clark, turned out to be a woman in her 50s with attentive gray eyes. She didn't interrupt while I told her everything from George's funeral to the visit from social services. When I finished, she said, "Mrs. Wilson, you need to understand. If your children file to have you declared incompetent, they might be granted temporary guardianship. That would give them the right to control your property, including your home. And what can I do? Get ahead of them. Find a doctor you trust and undergo an independent medical evaluation. Ask for a written statement confirming you're fully competent. And keep gathering proof of your independence." I left her office with a folder full of brochures on property rights and a sense that I finally had a strategy. A few days later, Gavin came for tea. He sat down at the table, took a folder out of his bag, and placed it in front of me. "Mom, I don't want this to feel like pressure, but we need to settle the matter of the house. This is a power of attorney. It would let me react quickly if any legal or financial issues come up." "Issues with the house or with you?" I asked, looking him in the eye. He sighed. "Mom, why do you say that? We're family." I didn't argue. I simply switched on the recorder in my pocket and let him talk. He listed the benefits of the power of attorney, explaining how it would take a load off my shoulders. I nodded, pretending to listen seriously. When he left, I wrote everything down in my journal and saved the audio file. The next day, Lauren came with another suggestion. A trial stay in a cozy residence for a month. You can see if you like it. No obligations. Just a test. And the house in the meantime? We'll look after it, of course. Maybe even do some renovations. That was the second approach. Both times they came separately but spoke almost the same words. That meant they had a joint plan, and it was moving forward. That evening I went to see Mary again. I told her everything. She shook her head and said, "You know, Margaret, you've always been gentle. But sometimes, gentle is just another word for easy to use. You think I should be tougher? I think you should be a rock. So if they try to push harder, they break themselves instead." I went home, sat at the table, and wrote on the first page of a new notebook. "From this day, no weakness. The house is me. And I'm not going to disappear." I didn't yet know that their next attempt would be the boldest and most dangerous. It happened on a Thursday morning. The kind of morning when the air is still heavy with dew, and even the sun seems hesitant to rise. I was having my tea when there was a knock at the door. Two women stood outside, one in a navy skirt suit with a folder, the other in a cardigan and glasses. "Mrs. Wilson? We're from Adult Protective Services. We received reports of possible self-neglect and cognitive decline. We'd like to speak with you." I stepped aside and let them in. If I refused, that alone could be taken as uncooperative behavior. They asked questions. Did I forget to pay bills? Did I take my medication regularly? Did I sometimes feel disoriented in my own home? I answered calmly, in full sentences, making sure to keep my voice steady. I offered them tea. One of them looked around the house, noting things down, the clean floor, the neatly arranged photos, the fresh bread on the counter. I could see in her eyes, this wasn't matching the picture she'd been given. Finally, I brought out my folder. These are my recent bills, paid on time. Here's my medication chart. Here's a note from my doctor confirming I am in good health, mentally and physically. They exchanged glances. The one with glasses asked, "Has anyone pressured you about moving out or giving up your home?" I looked straight at her. Yes, my children. They thanked me for my time and left. I stood at the window, watching their car disappear down the road. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from relief. I had proof they were trying to build a case, and I had blocked it. That evening, Gavin called. "Mom, why did you tell social services we pressured you?" "They called me today." "Because it's the truth," I said. He was silent for a long moment before muttering, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I hung up before he could say more. I used to think legal matters were just boring paperwork for people in suits with briefcases. Now I saw them differently, like weapons. And I needed to learn how to use them. First, I made it a rule to keep everything. Grocery receipts, pharmacy slips, letters from neighbors, even Mary's little notes offering pie. I put it all into a separate folder. Dates, signatures, stamps, anything that could prove I lived a normal, independent life. Then I bought a small voice recorder. It fit in the pocket of my housecoat and switched on with a single motion. I didn't know if the recordings would ever be useful, but I felt that sooner or later I'd have to prove my children weren't caring guardians, just people with a plan for my house. A few days later I called a legal clinic. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice calm and even. The woman on the line listened carefully and suggested we meet. "The main thing," she said, "is to have as many facts as possible, not just words. Recordings, documents, witnesses. That will help if this ends up in court or with adult services." I went to the meeting in my best dark blue coat, hair neatly done. Not to impress anyone, but because I knew any hint of neglect could be used as evidence. The lawyer, Mrs. Clark, was a woman in her 50s with attentive gray eyes. She didn't interrupt while I told her everything from George's funeral to the social worker's visit. When I finished, she said, "Mrs. Wilson, you need to understand. If your children file to have you declared incompetent, they could get temporary guardianship. Then they'd have the right to manage your property, including the house." "And what can I do?" "Get there first. Find a doctor you trust and undergo an independent medical evaluation. Ask for a written statement that you are fully competent. And keep gathering proof of your independence." I left the office with a folder of brochures on protecting property rights, and, for the first time, a sense that I had a strategy. A few days later Gavin came for tea. He sat down, pulled a folder from his bag, and set it in front of me. "Mom, I don't want this to feel like pressure, but we need to resolve the question of the house. Here's a power of attorney. It would let me act quickly if any legal or financial issues come up." "Issues with the house or with you?" I asked, looking him in the eye. He sighed. "Mom, why say it like that? We're family." I didn't argue. I just switched on the recorder in my pocket and let him talk. He listed the advantages of the power of attorney, how it would take the burden off you. I nodded, pretending to listen. When he left, I wrote a detailed note in my journal and saved the audio file. The next day Lauren came with another proposal. A 1-month trial stay in a cozy residence. "You can see if you like it. No obligations. Just a test. And the house while I'm gone? We'll look after it, of course. We could even freshen things up, do a little renovation." That was the second approach. Both times they came separately, but they spoke almost the same words, which meant they had a shared plan. And it was moving. That evening I went to see Mary again. I told her everything. She shook her head and said, "You know, Margaret, you've always been gentle. But sometimes, gentle is just a word that means you're easy to use. You think I should be tougher? I think you should be a rock. So if they push harder, they're the ones who break." I went home, sat at the table, and wrote on the first page of a new notebook. "From today, no weakness. The house is me. And I'm not going to disappear." I still didn't know their next attempt would be the boldest, and the most dangerous. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning when the air is still heavy with dew and even the sun seems reluctant to rise. I was sipping my tea when there was a knock at the door. 2 women stood outside, one in a navy skirt suit with a folder in her hands, the other in a cardigan and glasses. "Mrs. Wilson? We're from Adult Protective Services. We've received reports of possible self-neglect and cognitive decline. We'd like to speak with you." I stepped aside and let them in. If I refused, That alone could be used against me as uncooperative behavior. They began asking questions. Did I ever forget to pay bills? Did I take my medication regularly? Did I ever feel disoriented in my own home? I answered calmly, in full sentences, keeping my voice steady. I even offered them tea. One of them walked around the house, making notes, the clean floor, neatly arranged photographs, fresh bread cooling on the counter. I saw in her eyes that this picture didn't match the report she'd been given. Finally, I brought out my folder. These are my recent bills, all paid on time. Here's my medication chart. And here's a note from my doctor confirming I'm in good health, mentally and physically. They exchanged glances. The one with glasses asked quietly, "Has anyone been pressuring you to move out or give up your home?" I looked her straight in the eye. Yes, my children. They thanked me for my time and left. I stood by the window, watching their car disappear down the road. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from relief. I now had proof they were trying to build a case against me, and I had blocked it. That evening Gavin called. "Mom, why did you tell social services we pressured you?" "They called me today." "Because it's the truth," I said. He was silent for a moment before muttering, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." After the visit from social services, there was a lull. No surprise visits, no help with cleaning, no things mysteriously disappearing from the house. For almost 2 weeks, life felt almost normal again. But I knew my children too well. They weren't done. They were just waiting for the right moment. One evening, Lauren showed up with a cake. We had tea in the kitchen, chatting about her work, her friends, her vacation plans. For a moment, I almost believed the tension had passed. Then she leaned forward and spoke in a soft voice. "Mom, we should talk about the future. I don't want us to fight. You're alone now. Things can happen. Falls, illnesses. We just want you to be safe." "I am safe. Here. In my own home. But what if you're not?" From her bag, she pulled out another brochure. This time not glossy, but clinical-looking, from a facility on the outskirts of town. The rooms looked small and cold. "No," I said firmly. Her smile faded. "Why do you have to be so stubborn? We're trying to help." "I'm not being stubborn. I'm protecting what your father and I built." She left soon after, the cake barely touched. The next morning, I went to the bank to handle some documents. Mr. Patel, the manager, leaned over the counter and whispered, "Mrs. Wilson, your son was here last week asking about your accounts. Said he was your power of attorney." "I never gave him that authority." "That's what I thought. I told him we couldn't discuss anything without proof. But be careful." That afternoon, I went straight to Mrs. Clark, my lawyer. "They're not stopping," I told her. "Then we won't either," she replied. "I suggest putting the house into a trust in your name. That way, no one can sell it without your consent, even if they try to get guardianship." We finished the paperwork within a week. When I signed the documents, I felt a calm, steady strength fill me. A few days later, Gavin and Lauren arrived together. Their tone had changed. This time they came with kindness. "Mom, maybe we've been too pushy," Gavin said. "We just love you and want you to be comfortable." Lauren nodded. "Yes. We're sorry if we made you feel pressured." I looked at them, my children, the people I had once rocked to sleep, fed, comforted, and I understood something. Love does not erase betrayal. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly. "But this house is no longer just a house. It's my life story. And I intend to live that story until the very end." They didn't know about the trust. They didn't know every conversation had been recorded. They didn't know I had turned from someone easy to push aside into someone they could no longer move. When they left, I stood by the window, watching the sunset spill gold over the garden George and I had planted together. And I thought, I'm still here. I'm still me. And sometimes, the greatest victory of all is simply staying yourself, no matter who tries to take that away. I hung up before he could say more.